Commence primary ignition.
Ladies, gentlemen, and tarnished of all ages, there are a lot of very cool things that were added in the Shadow of the Erdtree expansion for Elden Ring, and while some of them were strong from the start, others have just been in a sort of middle ground position where they are mechanically quite strong, but just need that slight push over the edge into becoming ridiculously powerful. Yesterday saw the coming of patch 1.13, and with it, a number of these new toys that we have been elevated to this stage. One of my personal new favorites being the Light of Miquella incantation. This thing is absolutely brutal, raising you up into the air to summon a pillar of light with a rain of aftershocks hitting a couple of seconds later on your target's location if they aren't moving. Against more mobile enemies, this can be a little bit less reliable, but thanks to this incantation now having an extra damage boost source from the patch changes, even just the initial burst of damage from the initial hit is so high that it's just an extremely valuable spell now to cast in the right build, especially as it's one of those special spells that will still cast even if you get knocked out of the animation for it as long as you've already started it, which means that you can essentially purposely choose whether you want to use Endure or not based on what your enemy is doing, and even if you cast it and get instantly thwacked in the face, it's basically just a trade. You don't lose anything because the full cast goes off, you just lose a bit of health, which honestly could be quite good in comparison to taking a full combo. It's really quite impressive, so let's break down how to make this as impressive as you're seeing here, with the context that, hey, if you were wondering, especially after this patch, this spell is extremely good, and the whole setup working the way that it does means that we also get to play around with a lot of health regen stuff too, at least in situations where we are allowed to cast properly before actually engaging a fight. And this means that with something like Saint of the Bud, for example, you can create just a field of health regen underneath you while you cast Light of Miquella with its insane range, no matter how the boss is actually doing or what they choose to attack you with. So today let's dive into the weapons that make this absolutely shine, the armor set to boost it all, the talismans that make it reach its proper heights and give it a bit of adaptability, and then we'll go over the Wonderous Flask upgrades for the setup, and then the spells that you want as well, aside from the main star of the show itself, of course, and then we'll talk about how to spend your levels, and then finally just some tips on how to play and the buff cycle of the whole thing, with the final caveat that I will be assuming that you already have, or at least know how to get, any parts of this build that are from the base game. Starting off then for weapons, you will want Misericord in your right hand, specifically as this is a dagger with bonus crit damage scaling, and this incantation does do poise damage. You can set this to Sacred Affinity to make it scale better with our Faith stat, and then we put Endure on this as an Ash of War. As mentioned, you don't always want to use Endure, but this gives you a bunch of bonus poise, which makes you actually able to cast in situations where you might not otherwise be able to, but because of the amount of poise it gives you, it can actually result in you taking more damage taken than necessary in some situations. Basically, this just comes with knowledge of combos and patterns and knowing when to use it and when to not, because having access to it is really useful, so even if it's worse in some moments, you still want the option. Then we have the Sword of Light. This is a legendary weapon new to the DLC, and the reason that we have this is as a sort of back pocket buff stick, as using the weapon skill applies a body buff that increases holy damage done by 20% for 1 minute after use. Then in your left hand, you want a seal. The best one for this is the Erdtree seal at level 150 with my stat spread, but as usual for incantations, if you are far enough past level 150 and you split your stats into both faith and intelligence, then the Golden Order seal would just overtake it eventually. Then I just have a tiny low weight shield for the purposes of putting the Holy Ground Ash of War on to stack our first positional heal over time effect. It does technically make it a bit smoother to have a spare seal in your right hand third slot, just for the sake of casting minor Erdtree and using Holy Ground a little bit quicker when entering a boss room. Then the seal that you use for that purpose doesn't really matter, but having it with no weight would be ideal. Then we have our armor for this, and for the helmet, you want ideally the Circlet of Miquella. This increases intelligence, faith, and arcane by 1 point each, as well as boosting the damage of the Light of Miquella incantation by 10%. This was the thing that was fixed in the patch. It just didn't infect the incantation before, even though it said that it would in its description. Now it does, and that 10% is actually surprisingly meaningful because it stacks multiplicatively with all of our other bonuses that we have going on here to boost the spell too. This, well, it comes after you defeat Radahn and Miquella, the final boss of the DLC, from interacting with the memory in the boss arena. And this is where we reach the one sort of sticking point of this build, which is that you can't really logistically use this in your first playthrough through the DLC unless you specifically beeline the final boss and then round back to everything else. It sort of has to be in New Game Plus, or you can just sort of bring it back to the main game too if you really want to, but because both this helmet and the spell itself are rewards for the final boss fight, it sort of limits what you can actually do with it on a first run. For the rest of your armor then, you either want Rakshasa set for 6% bonus damage across the 3 separate pieces, or just use fashion of your choice in these slots if that 6% isn't worth to you being all red and metally in our Holy Death Star build. Past that, we have our Talismans then, the Flux Canvas Talisman for an 8% boost to incantation damage, the Faithful's Canvas Talisman for a 4% boost to incantation damage, and then the Sacred Scorpion Charm for a 12% boost to holy damage dealt at the cost of some damage negation. Then in the last slot is a bit of a flex slot. Dragon Crest Great Shield is just the most generically useful one here, especially if you're going to trade and take hits in order to cast the spell, but in some situations on certain bosses, the radahn Icon Talisman unlocks openings that you wouldn't actually be able to cast within otherwise, so this is a really neat one to consider as well, but generally a little bit less comfortable of a pick for most bosses. Moving on from that, then we have our Wondrous Flask of Physic upgrades, and in here we of course want the Holy Shrouding Cracked Tear for a 20% boost to holy damage done for 3 minutes after you drink it. Then it becomes a sort of comfort choice for your other slot, as it's quite usual for this slot honestly, either the Bloodsucking Crystal Tear for 20% damage boost for 3 minutes at the cost of constant low health drain, or if you are less comfortable with the boss's moveset and you're worried that you might get hit and the health drain will be a negative, you can swap this to the Opaline Hard Tier for another bump to your damage negation to make trading casts for hits a bit less painful as well. Then we have our spells themselves, Blessing of the Erdtree for a nice chunky 12 HP per second regen in our regen buff slot for 90 seconds after casting, then Golden Vow for 15% bonus damage and 10% bonus damage negation for 80 seconds after casting. Then we have Minor Erdtree, a new positional heal over time. It drops under you when you cast it. This often is a bit hard to actually cast and get down in a lot of these boss fights in the DLC, but given that we don't really have to move to hit the boss, only to actually dodge, this can actually have a lot of use in certain moments. This comes from the Hinterland region of the DLC, just up the main hill in the middle of the Shaman village. Quite hard to miss, honestly, it's very bright and very noticeable. Then finally, Light of Miquella itself, of course, which comes from the remembrance of the final boss of the DLC. With that covered then, let's dive into the stats and attributes that you want to get the same results that I'm doing here. 60 Vigor to begin with, of course, then you want to reach 80 Faith for the soft cap of incantation scaling, keeping in mind that the Circlet of Light Helmet will give you 1 bonus level of Faith 2 when equipped. Then we have the rest of your points, and you'll want to get your Endurance to 14, that is the sweet spot for our actual setup, equip load wise, and then dump the rest of your points into Mind to let you cast the incantation 3 times with some Endures mixed in between 2 before you need to use an FP Flask, which feels like about the right amount between openings. If you were higher than level 150, you would either want to dump a ton of points into Intelligence, as that's specifically 43 Intelligence and 72 Faith, the minimum requirement for the incantations. The Golden Order Seal would overtake the Erdtree Seal in its incantation scaling, thus increasing your damage, and it just gets better past those numbers, the more points that you have. But then also more points in Mind would be quite good for this as well, as it is definitely more than a bit of an FP guzzler. Then finally, let's talk about a little bit just about how to actually play the build in action and the buff cycle order before starting a difficult encounter. Blessing of the Erdtree because it lasts 90 seconds, then Golden Vow, which lasts 80 seconds, then the Sword of Light skill, which gives you a buff that lasts for 60 seconds, drink your FP Flask, drink your Wondrous Flask, switch to the actual dagger, and then enter the boss room. If it is a boss with a decent opening at the start, you can then choose to cast Minor Erdtree and then Holy Ground right near the entrance, then just switch out your weapons and fire out some artillery from Light of Miquella. Otherwise, just use the spell to begin with when you enter the fight. Learn when using Endure will create better openings in a fight so that you know when and when not to use it. That is honestly the main difficulty of using this build against every single boss. The results are honestly pretty impressive the second that you learn which openings are ideal though. That just about does it for today then everyone, a proper orbital laser Death Star style Light of Miquella boss slaying build that actually isn't bad for level clearing at all either, due to just a decent dagger with the right scaling on it as well. I hope you all enjoyed this then, and I hope you also actually enjoy using this build for yourself if you try it out too. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.